When the smoke of Stalingrad still hung over the frozen Volga, deep within Germany's war industry, a new idea was born, one that came from desperation and imagination alike. The Wehrmacht had realized that the war it was fighting in 1943 was not the same war it had begun in 1939. Blitzkrieg, the swift strike that conquered Europe, was crumbling in the ruins of cities. Every street, every building became a fortress, and conventional tanks found themselves bleeding in the alleys of brick and stone. Engineers at Henschel and Alket were ordered to conceive something monstrous, a weapon that could obliterate an entire block with one shot, something to break the stalemates of urban combat. The result was the Sturmtiger, the Storm Tiger, a siege weapon built on the chassis of the Tiger Thorn heavy tank, but transformed into something almost mythical in appearance and power. Its main gun, the 380 mm Raketenwerfer 61 L5.4, was not a normal cannon, but a rocket mortar that could fire a 345-kilogram shell capable of leveling entire buildings. It was a weapon that combined the brute force of artillery with the armor of a tank, a moving fortress designed to crush resistance in cities like Leningrad or Warsaw. Yet, when it rolled into service in late 1944, the war was already lost. The Luftwaffe had no control of the skies, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, and the Reich was collapsing under its own weight. Only 18 Sturmtigers were ever completed. Too few and too late to change history. But what if this monster had appeared earlier? What if, in 1942, when Germany still held the initiative, the Sturmtiger had been unleashed upon the battlefields of the world? Would cities have fallen faster, armies shattered, and perhaps the war itself taken a different turn? To answer that question, we must go back, not to 1944, but to the summer of 1942, when Hitler's forces stood at the gates of Stalingrad. Imagine the same city, but instead of Tiger tanks and Stugs struggling through rubble, a line of Sturmtigers appears, their massive rocket mortars loaded and ready. Each shot they fire explodes with the force of an air raid, vaporizing entire positions, collapsing bunkers, and sending shock waves through defenders' morale. The psychological impact alone would have been immense. Soviet troops described normal German shelling as thunderous, but a Sturmtiger S rocket detonation could shatter windows miles away and deafen soldiers caught in its radius. Its 300 mm warhead could penetrate reinforced concrete several meters thick. In the tight streets of Stalingrad, where every basement and wall became a battlefield, that kind of destructive power might have erased entire defensive sectors in minutes. The Red Army's famous strongholds, the grain elevator, the tractor factory, could have been reduced to dust before infantry ever advanced. The Germans, instead of fighting house to house, could have used these machines as rolling sledgehammers, turning resistance into rubble before moving in. But power always comes with a cost. The Sturmtiger was not fast. It was slow, heavy, and consumed fuel Germany barely had even in 1943. Reloading its massive rockets required the crew to open the rear hatch and manually hoist each shell, a process that took minutes and exposed them to enemy fire. Still, if introduced 2 years earlier, during the height of German industrial strength, these problems might have been mitigated. The Sturmtiger could have been produced in the dozens or even hundreds, supported by logistics that had not yet collapsed under Allied bombing. In 1942, such a weapon would have been a shock to the world, a symbol of unstoppable destruction. Allied intelligence might have viewed it as another step toward total mechanized warfare, and Soviet morale could have cracked in cities under siege. History, however, gave this beast no such chance. When it finally arrived in 1944, it found itself fighting not in offense, but in desperation, defending German soil from invaders, firing its last shells in the ruins of Cologne and the ashes of Berlin. Its creators had dreamed of a weapon that would break cities. Instead, it defended a dying empire. And so, the Sturmtiger became a paradox of war, a weapon of immense power, born too late to matter. But in the world of what-ifs, where time bends and fate rewrites itself, we can imagine it differently. The Sturmtiger of 1942 would not have been a relic. It would have been the face of German dominance. The siege of Stalingrad, the destruction of Leningrad, even the Allied landings might have taken on new meanings under the shadow of this iron monster. And so begins our journey into an alternate past, a world where the Sturmtiger did not arrive too late, but right on time. In this alternate history, the year is 1942, and the German war machine still moves with terrifying precision. The Wehrmacht advances deep into Soviet territory, and the city of Stalingrad stands as both a strategic and symbolic prize. It is here, on the banks of the Volga River, that the fate of two empires collides. Yet, in this version of history, something is different. Among the columns of panzers and infantry divisions rolling toward the city are the first battalions of a new and mysterious weapon. They call it the Sturmtiger. Reports from the front describe it as a bunker on tracks, a steel monster armed with a weapon so devastating that it can erase entire buildings in seconds. As the Germans encircle Stalingrad, the Sturmtigers are brought forward for their baptism of fire. The city, already shattered by weeks of bombing, becomes the perfect proving ground. Soviet defenders, dug into the ruins, wait for tanks to appear as usual, but instead they hear a low, mechanical rumble, followed by an unfamiliar hiss. Then a flash brighter than lightning tears the skyline apart. The first 300mm rocket shell slams into a Soviet strongpoint at the tractor factory, and within an instant, the structure disintegrates in a rolling ball of fire. Those within are gone before they can even react. Witnesses describe the explosion as if an air raid had struck the ground itself. The psychological effect is immediate. Soviet morale, hardened by months of war, is shaken to its core. Soldiers who once laughed at German armor now whisper about the new city destroyer. Commanders struggle to hold the line as reports of total annihilation spread through the ranks. For the Germans, this is the breakthrough they had dreamed of. The Sturmtigers advance slowly but relentlessly, their armor shrugging off machine gun fire and shrapnel, while their massive rockets demolish every defensive position ahead. Infantry follow cautiously, occupying zones that minutes earlier had been solid buildings. The streets of Stalingrad, once symbols of Soviet resilience, are reduced to smoking craters. The Luftwaffe, coordinating from above, directs the Sturmtigers toward the most entrenched resistance points, creating synchronized firestorms that consume entire districts. The Volga itself runs black with smoke and debris. The world has never seen destruction like this, but the use of such a weapon also changes the very nature of warfare. Urban combat, once defined by brutal close-quarters fighting, becomes a contest of annihilation. Civilians caught in the path of the Sturmtigers vanish along with the defenders. There are no prisoners, no survivors, only ruins. Soviet generals realize that traditional defenses are useless. Bunkers crumble, barricades turn to dust, and entire streets disappear under the monstrous blasts. Counterattacks fail to reach the machines. Artillery shells bounce off their thick frontal armor, and anti-tank rifles are as effective as pebbles. Even Katyusha rockets, once the pride of Soviet artillery, prove too scattered to stop the armored beasts. In desperation, Soviet engineers attempt to mine the narrow passages and lure the Sturmtigers into traps, but their sheer weight crushes everything beneath them. The battlefield becomes a graveyard of Soviet courage, buried under concrete and dust. By late October 1942, the city that in our timeline became the grave of the German Sixth Army now looks entirely different. In this alternate version, Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, never happens as planned. The Red Army cannot mass forces around the city because Sturmtiger bombardments have turned supply routes and staging areas into infernos. The encirclement that historically trapped General Paulus's forces fails to materialize. Instead, German lines hold firm, bolstered by the terrifying new weapon. The Soviet High Command, stunned and unsure of how to counter this development, begins pulling back forces to reassess. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army loses not just ground, but confidence. The myth of German invincibility, shattered in real history at Stalingrad, now grows even stronger. Yet, within the German command, a quiet unease spreads. The Sturmtiger's power is unquestionable, but so are its costs. Each shell requires massive amounts of explosive material and complex rocket components. Fuel shortages begin to appear, and logistics officers struggle to keep up with the demand. The machines consume resources like giants at a feast, and the Wehrmacht's overstretched supply lines begin to creak. But Hitler is enthralled. To him, the Sturmtiger is proof of Aryan ingenuity, a divine hammer meant to crush his enemies. He demands more, ordering factories to divert steel and fuel from other projects to build additional units. Propaganda ministers spread the legend of the Sturmtiger, showing footage of its destructive might in newsreels. To the German public, it is the embodiment of unstoppable power, a symbol of hope that the war can still be won. As winter falls over the ruins of Stalingrad, the city burns under a new kind of siege. Where once men fought room to room, now the battle is fought between machines and ghosts. The Sturmtiger has given Germany a new kind of dominance, one rooted in fear and destruction rather than strategy. But even as the Reich celebrates, the seeds of its downfall are still present. Because for every shell fired, for every building reduced to dust, the cost of maintaining this mechanical terror grows heavier. The Wehrmacht may win Stalingrad, but the strain on its industry and fuel reserves is beginning to show. And while the Soviets retreat eastward, they are not defeated, only waiting, watching, and learning. This victory, as brutal and decisive as it seems, comes at a price that Germany cannot yet see. The Sturmtiger has altered the course of the Eastern Front, but it has also accelerated the race between innovation and exhaustion. For now, the world stands in awe of the Sturmtiger's fire, but in the shadows of the Ural factories, a new response begins to take shape. The war has changed, and so has the balance of fear. The winter of 1942 bleeds into 1943, and the Eastern Front, once frozen in stalemate, now burns with renewed fury. In this alternate reality, the fall of Stalingrad has never come. Instead, it is the Red Army that finds itself forced into retreat, shattered by the terrifying emergence of the Sturmtiger. The Germans, empowered by their monstrous new weapon, regain confidence and push forward with a brutality unseen since the early days of Operation Barbarossa. The Sturmtiger, once a concept born from desperation, is now the spearhead of German offensives across the front. Wherever it appears, Soviet defenses crumble like paper. Entire regiments are obliterated before they can even engage. The 380mm rocket mortar, firing its devastating shaped charged shells, carves through bunkers and fortified positions with ease. It is no longer simply a weapon. It has become a legend whispered in the trenches. Soviet soldiers speak of the roaring demon that breathes fire and death, and entire units scatter at the sound of its mechanical growl. In this new phase of the war, the German High Command reorganizes its strategy. The old blitzkrieg doctrine, once centered on speed and maneuver, evolves into a doctrine of annihilation. Each offensive begins with concentrated Sturmtiger bombardments, followed by armored thrusts and mechanized infantry sweeping through the ruins. Cities like Voronezh, Kursk, and Kharkov fall not after months of siege, but within days of systematic destruction. A single Sturmtiger battalion can level a defensive sector in hours, clearing the path for panzer divisions to advance unhindered. Hitler, intoxicated by success, orders mass production. Factories in Kassel, Vienna, and Pilsen are converted to build more of these steel monsters. Propaganda hails them as the miracle weapons that will secure the 1,000-year Reich. German scientists refine the rocket ammunition, improving its range and stability. Some models are even rumored to carry chemical or incendiary payloads, designed to flush out entrenched defenders with unimaginable ferocity. The impact on Soviet strategy is catastrophic. The Red Army, already struggling with coordination, now faces a weapon that renders its defensive doctrines obsolete. Trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank barriers offer no safety. Marshal Zhukov himself reports to the Kremlin that the enemy now possesses a weapon capable of erasing our positions before the battle even begins. Stalin, furious yet pragmatic, orders an urgent response. New tactics, new weapons, anything that can counter the Sturmtiger. Soviet engineers rushed to design heavier guns, larger artillery pieces, and improved anti-tank systems. The IS-2 heavy tank, historically introduced in 1944, is now pushed into accelerated development in early 1943, its 120mm gun specifically designed to penetrate Sturmtiger armor. But even with this effort, the tide cannot be easily turned. Every time the Soviets adapt, the Sturmtiger adapts faster. The Germans, emboldened by their dominance, push toward the Caucasus and the oil fields of Baku. This time, they succeed. With the Red Army retreating in disarray, and with Soviet morale at its lowest since 1941, the Wehrmacht captures vital oil reserves that in our timeline remained out of reach. Fuel now flows again to the Reich's war machine, feeding the very monsters that secured it. The Sturmtiger battalions, once rare, now number in the hundreds, each one a mobile fortress that changes the face of modern warfare. For the first time since the invasion of Poland, it seems as though Germany might actually win the war in the east. The front lines stabilize hundreds of kilometers beyond their historical positions. The Soviet Union bleeds, but it does not die. Deep within the Ural Mountains, far from the range of German bombers, factories continue to produce tanks, artillery, and aircraft in staggering numbers. The Soviets know they cannot outgun the Sturmtiger, but perhaps they can outlast it. Meanwhile, among the German generals, a quiet concern begins to take root. While the Sturmtiger brings victory, it also brings dependency. Every offensive now relies on these massive machines, which consume vast amounts of fuel, ammunition, and manpower to maintain. Each shell fired costs the equivalent of hundreds of standard artillery rounds. The logistics chains that stretch from Germany to the front are strained to the breaking point. Rail lines, clogged with shipments of 380mm rockets and spare parts, struggle to keep pace. When a Sturmtiger breaks down, as many do in the harsh Russian terrain, it often has to be abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. The invincible weapon is showing its flaws, hidden beneath its armor. The Allies take notice. British and American intelligence, intercepting reports from the Eastern Front, begin to fear that the new German siege tank could soon appear in the West. In London, military planners debate how to counter such a weapon if it were deployed along the Atlantic Wall or in North Africa. Churchill, ever the strategist, warns that the enemy's beast, if brought to the channel, could turn our landings into a slaughter. The Americans, watching from afar, accelerate their own tank development programs. The M26 Pershing is pushed ahead of schedule, and new anti-armor aircraft designs are considered. By the spring of 1943, the world stands at a crossroads. The Eastern Front burns brighter than ever, but Germany stands taller than it has in a year. Cities that once symbolized Soviet defiance are now smoking ruins. The Sturmtiger has not only changed the tide of battle, it has reshaped the psychology of war itself. The Red Army fights not against soldiers, but against fear, and fear is harder to kill than any tank. Yet within that fear lies something dangerous for Germany: overconfidence. Hitler believes the war can now be won through brute force alone, and his faith in the Sturmtiger blinds him to the reality of production limits, resource depletion, and the inevitable unity of the Allies. The Sturmtiger has turned the tide, yes, but in doing so, it has chained Germany's future to a single unsustainable weapon. As the summer of 1943 approaches, both sides prepare for the next great clash, the largest tank battle in history. But this time, the fields of Kursk will not echo with the rumble of Tigers and T-34s. Instead, they will tremble beneath the roar of the Sturmtiger. The question now is not who will fight harder, but whether the world itself can withstand the fire it is about to unleash. By late 1943, the balance of power had begun to shift. The Allies were learning, adapting, and innovating faster than the Reich could rebuild. Yet in this alternate timeline, the sudden appearance of the Sturmtiger shocked Allied intelligence. Reports from the Eastern Front described a fortress on tracks capable of vaporizing entire buildings with a single shell. The British and Americans initially dismissed these stories as Soviet exaggerations, until the first Sturmtigers appeared in Italy and Normandy. Conventional anti-tank weapons, such as the Piat or the American bazooka, were nearly useless against its armor. The 380mm rocket-propelled shells, designed for naval bombardment, could annihilate entire squads hiding behind thick stone walls. In the ruins of Monte Cassino, the Sturmtiger became legend, reducing Allied defensive positions to ash within minutes. Even when a direct hit was not achieved, the shock wave alone caused concussions and destruction within a 100-meter radius. Yet this overwhelming power came at a price. Each Sturmtiger required immense logistical support. Its shells weighed over 350 kilograms each and could only be loaded manually by a small crew. Resupply on the front line was a nightmare, as specialized cranes and vehicles were needed to handle ammunition. Allied reconnaissance planes began targeting the slow convoys that carried Sturmtiger shells, understanding that without its rockets, the beast was just an armored giant with claws but no teeth. In response, Allied tank destroyer crews were trained to avoid direct engagement. Instead, they relied on mobility and air power. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon became the true nemesis of the Sturmtiger. High above the battlefield, pilots hunted these mechanical monsters like predators circling wounded prey. A single bomb could destroy one, but only if the aircraft could locate it in the maze of urban rubble. The Germans, anticipating this, began using Sturmtigers mainly at night or during heavy fog. Their deafening barrages became ghostly echoes in the dark, massive shells streaking across the city like comets before exploding into firestorms. Civilians and soldiers alike spoke of them in whispers, calling them the roar of the tiger. Yet even this terror had limits. The Reich's production capacity was crumbling under Allied bombing. Factories in Kassel and Henschel could only produce a handful of Sturmtigers each month. Engineers were forced to cannibalize damaged Tiger tanks to create new ones. Meanwhile, the Allies perfected their countermeasures: aerial reconnaissance, artillery spotters, and bunker-busting bombs. The once invincible fortress began to feel the pressure of modern warfare, where speed, air superiority, and logistics ruled over sheer firepower. Still, the myth of the Sturmtiger grew. Soldiers who faced it described the psychological trauma as worse than the physical danger. The low, thunderous rumble of its engine signaling the arrival of death itself. For every shell it fired, the earth trembled, and morale shattered. Even in defeat, the Sturmtiger carved its name into the history of mechanized warfare, a symbol of late-war desperation, innovation, and the haunting question, what if it had come sooner? By early 1944, the legend of the Sturmtiger had spread across all fronts. Allied propaganda warned troops about the doom cannon, while German media celebrated it as the miracle weapon that would reverse the course of the war. Yet, despite its monstrous power, the realities of war were unforgiving. On paper, the Sturmtiger was invincible. 150 meters of frontal armor, the destructive force of a naval mortar, and the psychological dominance of a god of thunder. But, on the battlefield, things were different. Its heavy weight made it painfully slow, consuming massive amounts of fuel that the Reich could barely supply. Bridges trembled under its bulk, and muddy terrain turned it into an immobile fortress. Each shell required careful handling. Only 14 could be carried at once. After those were fired, the crew had to retreat for resupply, turning every Sturmtiger mission into a calculated gamble between destruction and survival. As the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, the Sturmtiger's strengths became its greatest weaknesses. Urban warfare gave it moments of glory, collapsing buildings, clearing entire blocks with one shot. But open terrain exposed its sluggish nature. Swift Allied armor units, supported by air dominance, learned to outmaneuver it. The sound of approaching aircraft became the death knell for these steel monsters. Even the Tiger's famed armor could not withstand a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. Crews began camouflaging their machines in ruins or forests, waiting for ambush opportunities rather than open confrontation. But Germany's shrinking territory and crumbling logistics left fewer places to hide. Each destroyed Sturmtiger was a devastating loss, not only in metal, but in morale. Inside the German command, opinions divided. Some saw the Sturmtiger as a symbol of hope, proof that German engineering could still defy the odds. Others recognized it as a symbol of futility, a masterpiece built for a war already lost. For the soldiers on the ground, it was both, a savior and a tomb. They spoke of how the firing of its 300mm rocket felt like unleashing the wrath of the gods, but also how every time it fired, its location was revealed to the enemy's planes and artillery. Its thunderous voice could not be silenced, and in a world ruled by radar and reconnaissance, silence was survival. By mid-1944, the Sturmtiger was less a weapon of strategy and more a weapon of symbolism. It embodied Germany's desperate hope that technology could compensate for dwindling manpower, lost territories, and collapsing alliances. Each one rolled into battle like a relic of a bygone era, powerful but obsolete in a world that now demanded speed, coordination, and air control. The Sturmtiger had come too late to change the war's outcome, yet too powerful to be forgotten. It stood as the last roar of the German war machine, a titan born in the ashes of defeat, whose presence reminded the world that even giants can fall when the tide of history turns against them. As 1945 dawned, Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own creation. The once mighty Reich was now fighting for survival on two fronts, its cities burning under relentless Allied bombing, and its armies retreating from the east. In this grim setting, the Sturmtiger, this symbol of ultimate destruction, was unleashed for the last time. On the Western Front, a handful of these machines roamed through the ruins of Cologne, Essen, and the Ruhr Valley. They fired their last shells not in victory, but in defiance. Civilians hiding in cellars would later describe the earth-shattering explosions as if the gods themselves were tearing the world apart. Each 380mm rocket obliterated entire apartment blocks, leaving only blackened craters. Yet each shot also drained Germany's dwindling ammunition reserves, and every shell fired brought the inevitable closer: silence. At the same time, on the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pushed through Poland and into the heart of Germany. There, in the forests near Königsberg and the ruins of Warsaw, a few Sturmtigers fought their last stands. They were no longer part of coordinated divisions. They were isolated fortresses, abandoned by the collapsing Wehrmacht command structure. Their crews, weary and hopeless, often fought to the last shell. Soviet tank crews feared the Sturmtiger's devastating firepower. Even the mighty IS-2 could be destroyed by a single well-placed shot. But they learned to outsmart it. Fast-moving infantry armed with anti-tank charges, supported by artillery, swarmed around the lumbering beasts, like wolves attacking a wounded mammoth. Once immobilized, the Sturmtiger's thick armor became a tomb, sealing its crew inside a steel coffin. In one of the final documented engagements, a Sturmtiger was cornered in the city of Kassel. Surrounded and out of ammunition, its commander ordered the destruction of the vehicle to prevent capture. The explosion was so immense it flattened an entire street. The blast became a fitting symbol of the weapon's tragic purpose, an act of annihilation turned inward. Others were captured intact by the Allies, who marveled at the engineering behind such a machine. To British and American soldiers, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a relic of a war that had pushed human ingenuity to its darkest extremes. By May 1945, the war was over. The Sturmtiger, conceived as a city-destroying titan, ended up buried beneath the rubble of the very cities it was meant to protect. Only a dozen survived the war, most of them inoperable, their massive frames rusting in scrap yards or displayed in museums. The last one stood silently, stripped of fuel and shells, as Allied troops marched past, silent monuments to a doomed empire's final roar. The Sturmtiger had promised domination through destruction, but in the end, it served only as a grim reminder that no weapon, no matter how powerful, can save a nation when history itself turns against it. In the aftermath of World War II, as Europe lay in ruins and the world struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction, the Sturmtiger became both a symbol and a question. It represented the pinnacle of wartime engineering, a weapon so immense in power, yet so limited in purpose. Military historians, engineers, and strategists studied its remains, trying to understand what it truly meant. Was it genius or madness? Innovation or desperation? The Sturmtiger, like many of Germany's late war weapons, was born from a belief that superior technology could overcome impossible odds. But in the grand theater of war, it proved that even the most advanced machines are powerless without strategy, resources, and time. Captured Sturmtigers were examined in Allied proving grounds. The British and Americans admired its craftsmanship, the precision of its rocket system, and the audacity of its design. Yet they also recognized its fatal flaws. It was over-engineered, heavy, and inflexible, built for a kind of warfare that no longer existed. The world was moving toward mobility, speed, and precision. The jet engine, radar, and atomic bomb had already redefined the battlefield. Against such technologies, a 65-ton steel fortress crawling through rubble seemed almost prehistoric. And yet, the psychological impact it left behind was undeniable. Soldiers who had faced it never forgot the deafening roar of its rocket or the blinding flash that followed. It was less a weapon and more a force of nature, a mechanical thunderstorm forged by human hands. As the decades passed, the Sturmtiger's legacy evolved. Historians began to see it as a reflection of Nazi Germany itself, powerful, intimidating, but doomed by its own excess. It embodied the idea that brute strength without balance leads to collapse. The lessons it left behind would influence future warfare for generations. Nations realized that technology alone could not win wars. Logistics, adaptability, and intelligence mattered far more. The Cold War would see new kinds of giants, nuclear missiles, intercontinental bombers, and tanks far more efficient than their ancestors. But the ghost of the Sturmtiger lingered in every design meeting and military doctrine that sought power without purpose. Today, only a few Sturmtigers remain, preserved in museums in Germany and Russia. Visitors stand before them in silence, dwarfed by their massive presence, imagining what it must have been like to see such a machine alive on the battlefield. It stands not as a triumph, but as a warning, an artifact of a time when humanity sought salvation through destruction. Its steel hull is cold, its engine forever silent, but its story echoes through history as a testament to the paradox of war, that the pursuit of ultimate power often leads not to victory, but to ruin. The Sturmtiger may have come too late to change the outcome of the war, but its shadow endures, reminding us that even the mightiest machines are nothing against the unstoppable tide of time.